In the heart of Boston's winter, where city lights cast long shadows and cold hearts beat in silence, an unlikely story of love is about to unfold. James Connor, a decorated veteran who left the battlefield only to find a different kind of emptiness, spends his days seeking purpose in small acts of kindness. But on this bitter December morning, when he shares his warm coffee and sandwich with a shivering elderly woman on a frost-covered park bench, he has no idea he's about to change both their lives forever. Eleanor Richardson, worth billions, but bankrupt in spirit, has walked away from her empire disguised as a homeless woman, searching for something her wealth could never buy, a genuine connection. What happens next will challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and the true value of a human heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual never changed for James Connor. At precisely 500 hours, his eyes would snap open, muscle memory from 15 years of military service still governing his body like an internal drill sergeant. His small one-bedroom apartment in South Boston wasn't much, but the neat minimalism spoke of a man who'd learned to find comfort in order. The nightmares had visited again last night. They always did, when the winter wind howled through the city's concrete canyons, too similar to the mountain passes of Afghanistan. James pushed himself up from his perfectly made bed, his left knee protesting with familiar stiffness. The purple heart on his dresser caught the pre-dawn light, a reminder of the day that ended his military career, but not his desire to serve. In the bathroom mirror, a weathered face stared back at him. Deep crow's feet around steel blue eyes, salt and pepper, hair still maintained at military length. At 45, he wore his years like battle scars, each line telling a story of sacrifice and survival. The coffee maker hummed to life as James began his morning push-ups. 100 every day, without fail. Mike, his former squad mate and now best friend, often joked that James would do push-ups in his grave. But physical discipline was more than exercise. It was an anchor in a civilian world that sometimes felt as foreign as any war zone. His phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Still on for volunteer work at the center today? These kids need their hero stories." James smiled, typing back a quick affirmative. The Veteran Center had become his second home, a place where his experiences could help young soldiers transition back to civilian life. It wasn't saving the world, but maybe it was saving someone's world, and that had to count for something. As James prepared his simple breakfast of oatmeal and protein powder, his eyes drifted to the empty chair across his small kitchen table. The silence in his apartment seemed to grow louder with each passing year. He'd tried dating. Mike was always trying to set him up with his wife's friends. But civilian women didn't understand the weight he carried, and fellow veterans had their own battles to fight. The old radio on his counter played classical music, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, filling the space where conversation should be. His mother, before she passed, used to say that classical music was like a warm hug for the soul. These days, it was the closest thing to a hug he got. Shrugging on his worn leather jacket, James grabbed his extra sandwich and thermos of coffee, a habit born from years of seeing homeless veterans on his morning walk. His pension and part-time security consulting work kept him comfortable, and he believed that those who had enough had a duty to share. It wasn't much, but sometimes the smallest acts of kindness made the biggest difference. At least, that's what he told himself as he stepped out into the biting Boston winter, unaware that today's simple act of sharing would change everything. Eleanor Richardson stood in her palatial dressing room, surrounded by designer clothes worth more than most people's homes, and felt absolutely nothing. At 68, she had amassed a fortune that Forbes estimated at just over $3 billion, built a tech empire from the ground up, and was universally respected in the business world. She was also completely alone. The reflection in her full-length mirror showed an elegant woman with silver hair, styled in an expensive cut, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a car. But beneath the perfectly curated exterior, her eyes held a weariness that no amount of money could cure. Her last relationship had ended 6 months ago, when she discovered Gregory was more interested in merging their companies than their lives. With practiced movements, Eleanor began her transformation. First went the designer clothes, replaced by items she'd secretly purchased from second-hand stores. Her signature jewelry was locked away in her safe. The expensive hair was hidden under a worn wool hat. She'd spent weeks studying how to make herself invisible. The way people's eyes slid past the homeless, the way society had perfected the art of not seeing what it didn't want to see. Her letter to the board was brief but clear. She was taking an indefinite leave of absence for personal reasons. The company would continue under the leadership of her carefully selected executives. Her personal lawyer, the only person who knew a fraction of her plan, had instructions to maintain her affairs and release limited information to prevent a corporate panic. As she packed a small bag with essential items, Eleanor's hand brushed against the last photo taken of her and her late husband, Thomas. "You always said I was hiding from real life behind spreadsheets and acquisitions," she whispered to his smiling face. "You were right, my love. Thomas had been the only one who loved her before the money, before the success. In the 30 years since his death, she'd built an empire but lost herself. The security cameras caught a bundled figure leaving through the service entrance that morning, but no one paid attention to yet another worker heading out into the Boston winter. Eleanor Richardson, Billionaire CEO, disappeared into the city streets, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and a desperate hope to find something genuine in a world that had always wanted something from her. The first week on the streets had been a harsh education. She'd thought she'd prepared for everything, but nothing could have readied her for the bone-deep cold of sleeping on benches, the suspicious glares from people who previously would have courted her favor, or the overwhelming sense of invisibility. Yet in that invisibility, she found a strange kind of freedom. For the first time in decades, people looked at her, when they looked at all, and saw just Eleanor, not the Richardson fortune. She learned the rhythm of survival, which churches offered free meals, which shelters were safest, which parks were least patrolled. Her business acumen, which had once orchestrated billion-dollar deals, now calculated the optimal times to visit coffee shops where kind baristas might offer a free cup to a shivering elderly woman. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd never felt more alive than when pretending to be at rock bottom. James wasn't expecting to see her again, but there she was, on the same bench as yesterday, her shoulders hunched against the morning chill. He'd brought an extra sandwich again, this time intentionally. Turkey with cranberry sauce, his mother's old holiday recipe that he'd learned to make in her final days. "Good morning," he said, approaching slowly, the way he'd learned to approach most situations in life. Sudden movements rarely led to good things, whether in war zones or with spooked animals or nervous people. "I was hoping I'd see you here again." Eleanor looked up, and this time James noticed her eyes. Clear blue, intelligent, and carrying a depth that seemed at odds with her weathered appearance. "The young man with the coffee," she said, her voice carrying an educated lilt that she quickly tried to mask. "You're very kind, but you needn't worry about me." "I'm James," he said, settling on the bench beside her, leaving comfortable space between them. "And kindness isn't something to be rationed." He offered her half of his sandwich and a cup of coffee from his thermos. "Besides, I've never been good at eating alone." She hesitated before accepting, and James noticed her hands, soft, despite their apparent roughness. Different from the work-hardened hands he usually saw on the streets. "Eleanor," she said finally, accepting the coffee. "My name is Eleanor." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing breakfast as the morning joggers and early commuters passed by, each lost in their own rushed worlds. A street musician across the park began playing violin, the notes of Bach's air floating across the crisp morning air. "Bach," Eleanor said softly, almost to herself. "G-string. My husband used to play this." James turned to her, surprised. "You know classical music?" A flash of panic crossed her face, quickly hidden. From before. Another life." She took a sip of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "You learn to leave much behind, but music stays in your soul." "My mother loved classical music," James offered, feeling an unexpected ease in sharing. "She said it was what angels would play if they had orchestra seats." The memory brought a smile to his face. "She used to drag me to concerts when I was home on leave. Said a little culture wouldn't hurt between fighting wars." Eleanor's eyes softened. "You served?" 15 years. Special forces. He rarely talked about it, but something about her calm presence made it feel natural. "Got my ticket home the hard way. IED in Afghanistan. Left with a Purple Heart and a trick knee that tells me when it's going to rain better than any weather. App. And now you bring coffee and sandwiches to strangers in the park," Eleanor observed, her voice gentle. "The war may have taken your knee, but it clearly didn't take your humanity." James felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with coffee. Some things you carry back from war aren't bad, like knowing that small kindnesses matter, that everyone has a story worth hearing. "And what's your story, James?" Eleanor asked, turning to face him fully for the first time. Beyond the uniform and the kindness, he found himself telling her about his life, the quiet apartment, the volunteer work at the Veteran Center, his friendship with Mike. She listened with an intensity he rarely encountered, asking questions that somehow always seemed to cut right to the heart of things. As the morning wore on and his coffee ran dry, James found himself reluctant to leave. "There's a shelter on Maple Street," he said finally, standing up. "They're good people. Clean. Safe. If you ever need a place." Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she seemed to glow with an inner light that transformed her entire being. "Thank you, James, for everything. Perhaps I'll see you tomorrow." "Same bench, same time," he said, surprised by how much he wanted that to be true. "I'll bring more coffee." Walking away, James felt lighter somehow, as if sharing his morning with Eleanor had lifted a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Behind him, Eleanor watched him go, her heart heavy with the growing weight of her deception, yet lifted by the first real connection she'd felt in years. The storm hit Boston like a hammer falling on glass. Weather reports had warned of a severe system moving in from the Atlantic, but nobody had predicted its ferocity. Snow fell in thick, angry swirls, while wind howled through the streets with Arctic fury. The city had declared a state of emergency, urging everyone to stay indoors. James paced his apartment, unable to shake the image of Eleanor from his mind. He'd missed their morning meeting due to a Veteran Center emergency. A young soldier in crisis had needed immediate intervention. By the time he'd helped get the situation under control, the storm had already begun its assault on the city. But his weather alert blared from his phone again. Temperatures expected to drop to dangerous levels overnight. Homeless individuals strongly advised to seek emergency shelter. His jaw clenched. The shelters would be overwhelmed, and Eleanor had seemed reluctant to use them. Something about her pride, her dignity. It was familiar to him, reminded him of older veterans who'd rather freeze than accept charity. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his heavy winter coat. Mike's voice crackled through his phone, trying to talk sense into him. "You're not seriously going out in this, are you?" "James, it's suicide weather out there." "She's out there, Mike. I know her bench. I can't just—" "Your savior complex is going to get you killed one day, brother." Mike's sigh carried years of friendship and understanding. "Just be careful. That knee of yours won't thank you for playing hero in a blizzard." The bitter cold hit James like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The streets were nearly deserted, with only the occasional emergency vehicle pushing through the deepening snow. His military training kicked in automatically: conserve energy, maintain awareness, identify landmarks. The park was only 15 minutes away normally, but in these conditions it felt like traversing another world. He found her exactly where he feared she would be. Eleanor was huddled on their bench, barely visible under layers of threadbare blankets. Snow had built up around her like a white shroud, and for one terrifying moment, James thought he was too late. "Eleanor!" His voice was nearly lost in the wind. He reached her in 3 long strides, his knees screaming in protest. "Eleanor, wake up!" She stirred weakly, her face pale and lips tinged with blue. "James?" Her voice was faint, confused. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," he said, already shrugging off his outer coat to wrap around her. "Can you stand? We need to get you warm." When she struggled to rise, he made a quick decision. "I apologize in advance for this." With a grunt of effort, James lifted Eleanor into his arms. His knee threatened to buckle, but he locked it through sheer willpower. She felt lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made his heart ache. She tried to protest, but the words were lost in a violent shiver. "My apartment's closest," he said, more to keep himself focused than anything else. "Just hold on. Stay with me, Eleanor. Talk to me about Bach again." The journey back was a blur of pain and determination. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling about music or apologizing for being a burden. Each step was an exercise in endurance, his knee a source of constant agony. But James had carried wounded comrades through worse conditions. He could do this, he had to. Finally, mercifully, they reached his building. By the time he managed to get them both inside his apartment, James was running purely on adrenaline and muscle memory. The warmth hit them like a wave, and Eleanor stirred more consciously in his arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as he gently set her down on his couch. "I didn't want to impose—" "Shh," James interrupted, already moving to gather blankets. "We can talk later. Right now, you need to get warm." He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then headed to the kitchen to make hot tea, his grandmother's cure for everything from broken hearts to bullet wounds. As feeling returned to his own frozen limbs, James watched Eleanor's color slowly improve. Something protective and fierce stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his days of watching over his squad in combat. But this was different. This wasn't about duty or obligation. This was about something else entirely, something that both thrilled and terrified him. Eleanor's eyes met his over the rim of her teacup, and in them he saw a mixture of gratitude, fear, and something deeper that made his heart skip a beat. Neither of them knew it yet, but in the howling storm outside, fate had just dealt them both a hand that would change everything. Morning light filtered through James's modest curtains, casting gentle shadows across Eleanor's sleeping form on his couch. She woke to the soft sounds of classical music, Chopin's nocturnes playing from the old radio in the kitchen, and the aroma of fresh coffee. For a moment, disoriented by comfort, she forgot her chosen exile from wealth. Then reality crashed back, along with a wave of guilt so intense it made her chest ache. "You're awake," James's voice came from the kitchen. "How are you feeling?" His concern was genuine, untainted by the artificial sympathy she'd grown used to in her corporate life. He limped slightly as he brought her a steaming mug, his knee clearly still suffering from yesterday's rescue. "Better, thanks to you," she said, accepting the coffee. Her fingers brushed his, sending an unexpected jolt through her body. "James, about yesterday. You could have died coming after me like that." He settled into his armchair, shrugging off her concern. "Survived worse in Afghanistan. Besides, couldn't leave my breakfast companion to freeze, could I?" His smile was warm. "Unguarded. The storm's supposed to last another day. You'll stay here until it passes." It wasn't a question, but his tone left room for her dignity. Eleanor looked around his apartment, taking in details she'd missed last night. Everything was simple but meticulously maintained. A purple heart in the modest frame, dog tags hanging by the door, a shelf of books that ranged from military history to classical literature. No photos except one of a younger James with his squad, and another of an elderly woman who shared his eyes. His mother, she guessed. The TV in the corner was tuned to a news channel on mute. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw her own corporate photo flash across the screen, alongside headlines about her mysterious absence. James, focused on adjusting his knee brace, didn't notice. "I should go," she said suddenly, panic rising. "I've imposed enough." Eleanor, just her name spoken with quiet authority. "The shelters are all full. It's freezing outside." And he hesitated, then continued with military directness. "I sleep better knowing you're safe." Her heart twisted. When was the last time someone had cared about her safety for her sake, not for what her death would do to company stock prices? She looked down at her coffee, buying time to steady her voice. "You're a good man, James Connor." "Not good. Just," he searched for the word, "human." "Sometimes that's enough." He stood, wincing slightly. "I need to check in at the Veteran Center. Will you be okay here for a few hours? Make yourself at home." After he left, Eleanor found herself drawn to his bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spines of well-worn volumes, pausing on a collection of Frost's poetry. A piece of paper marked a page, and she opened it carefully. The poem was "The Road Not Taken," and in the margin, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Sometimes the harder path leads home." She sank onto the couch, the book clutched to her chest, tears threatening to fall. On the TV, another news story about her disappearance played silently. Eleanor Richardson, billionaire CEO, was being searched for across the country, and here she sat, in the home of a man who'd nearly crippled himself to save her, a man who offered kindness without agenda, a man she was lying to with every breath. The classical music played on, filling the apartment with its bittersweet melody. Eleanor had spent her life making billion-dollar decisions, but she'd never felt more torn than she did now, caught between the truth she needed to tell and the connection she desperately wanted to keep. 3 days into the storm, and they had fallen into an unexpected rhythm. Eleanor woke each morning to find James already up, doing his routine of push-ups despite his still healing knee. She'd taken to making his coffee, remembering exactly how he liked it, strong with just a touch of sugar, a detail that would have seemed beneath her a month ago, now felt like a precious secret. "You know," James said one morning, watching her move comfortably around his small kitchen, "you're surprisingly good at this." He caught her startled look and added quickly, "I mean, adapting. Most people who've been on the streets for a while, they struggle with 4 walls around them." Eleanor's hands stilled on the coffee pot. If he only knew how many walls she was truly used to. "Perhaps I was waiting to adapt to the right 4 walls," she said softly, then cursed herself for the slip. These moments of unguarded honesty were becoming dangerous. They spent their mornings sharing breakfast and stories. James told her about his missions, the ones he could talk about, and she found herself fascinated by his world of honor and clear purpose. In return, she shared carefully edited versions of her past, weaving truth with necessary fiction. "I used to work in business," she would say, watching his face for any sign of recognition, "but numbers were easier than people." "And now?" he asked, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Now I'm learning that some people are worth more than all the numbers in the world." The apartment filled with small changes that spoke of her presence. Her borrowed sweater draped over his chair. The kitchen organized with an efficiency that made him smile. Classical music playing more often than not. She'd discovered his mother's old collection of vinyl records and spent hours carefully cleaning and playing them. One evening, she found him struggling with his knee, face tight. With pain he tried to hide. Without thinking, she knelt beside his chair. "May I?" she asked, hands hovering over his leg. I used to help my husband with his arthritis." James hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers moved with practiced care, finding the knots of tension, working them loose with gentle pressure. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the gradual relaxation of his muscles under her touch. "Where did you really learn this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's heart stopped for a moment. What do you mean? These aren't the hands of someone who's been homeless long, he said, his voice still gentle but carrying an edge of something, curiosity, confusion, concern. They're too soft, too skilled. She pulled away, fear making her movements jerky. I should start dinner, she said, fleeing to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard James sigh, but he didn't pursue the question. That night, she lay awake on his couch, listening to the storm still raging outside. On his TV, muted as always, she caught glimpses of herself in news reports. The search for Eleanor Richardson was intensifying. Her board was getting nervous. Her absence was affecting stock prices. But here, in this small apartment with its military precision and unexpected warmth, she felt more real than she had in decades. James's quiet breathing from the bedroom down the hall had become the most comforting sound she knew. His simple life, built on honor and service rather than profit margins, called to something deep in her soul. She was falling in love with him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Worse, she suspected he was falling for her too. Not for Eleanor Richardson, billionaire CEO, but for Eleanor, the homeless woman who made his coffee and shared his love of classical music. The truth would have to come out eventually, and when it did, she would lose this precious, fragile thing they were building. The storm howled outside, but the real tempest was building in her heart. The Veteran Center was housed in an old brick building with an American flag snapping proudly in the winter wind. Eleanor felt James's hand at the small of her back as he guided her through the entrance, his touch both reassuring and electrifying. The storm had finally passed, but they'd fallen into such a comfortable routine that neither had mentioned her leaving. Fair warning, James said with a slight smile. Mike's going to have questions. He's protective. Inside, the center hummed with activity. Young veterans gathered around computers in a job search area, while others participated in what appeared to be a therapy session in a corner. The walls were covered with military photos and motivational posters, but what caught Eleanor's eye was a wall of heroes featuring local veterans who'd made good. Her heart clenched when she spotted a younger James in his dress uniform receiving his Purple Heart. Well, well, a booming voice called out. The hero of the storm finally brings his rescue mission to meet us. A broad-shouldered man with laugh lines around his eyes approached, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap. I'm Mike. This stubborn fool told me how he played knight in shining armor during the blizzard. Eleanor, she replied, shaking his hand. Her years of business training helped her maintain composure, but she could feel Mike's shrewd assessment behind his friendly demeanor. Come help me in the kitchen, a woman called out, Mike's wife Sarah, as Eleanor would learn. We're preparing lunch for the afternoon group. In the industrial kitchen, Eleanor found herself chopping vegetables, alongside Sarah and two other volunteers. It had been decades since she'd done such manual work, but her body remembered. Soon, she was offering suggestions for stretching their limited resources, skills learned from her early days of building her company on a shoestring budget. You've done this before, Sarah observed, watching Eleanor efficiently organize their prep work. Yes, in another life. It wasn't exactly a lie. Through the kitchen window, she could see James working with a young veteran, their heads bent together in serious conversation. The way he listened, fully present, reminded her of how he'd listened to her on that park bench. No wonder these broken warriors found healing in his presence. The morning passed quickly. Eleanor found herself drawn into the center's rhythm, helping where needed, listening to veterans' stories, offering quiet words of encouragement. She understood their struggles with civilian life more than they knew. She too lived in a world of masks and careful presentations. Then came the moment she'd been dreading. A group of potential donors arrived for a tour. Eleanor recognized two of them from charity galas she'd hosted. She ducked into the supply closet, heart pounding as they passed by. Eleanor? James's voice, concerned, followed her into her hiding place. Are you okay? Just needed a moment, she managed. It's overwhelming sometimes, all the people. He studied her face in the dim light, and she saw that same flicker of doubt cross his features. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" The words stuck in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, about her real identity, about why she'd walked away from her wealth, about how meeting him had changed everything. Instead, she found herself reaching for his hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, warm and strong and real. For a long moment they stood there in the quiet darkness, the air between them charged with unspoken words. "James, where'd you disappear to? The grant committee wants to meet our star counselor." Mike's voice broke the spell. "Coming!" James called back, but he didn't move immediately. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gentle caress that sent shivers down her spine. "We'll talk later." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. As she watched him leave, she pressed her hand to her heart, trying to calm its frantic beating. She was in too deep now. Every day she spent in James's world, experiencing the simple beauty of his life of service. The harder it became to imagine returning to her old life, but as she emerged from the closet and saw her own face flash across the TV in the common room, another news report about her disappearance, she knew time was running out. The truth would catch up to her one way or another. Evening had settled over Boston, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Eleanor sat curled in what had become her corner of James's couch, watching him clean his service pistol, a ritual she'd learned he performed every Sunday. His movements were precise, mechanical, yet there was something almost meditative about the process. "You never talk about it," she said softly. "The day you were injured." His hands stilled on the weapon. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and for a moment she saw him tense, his mind somewhere far away. "Some stories are harder to tell than others," he finally replied. "But you want to tell it now?" James reassembled the pistol with practiced ease, then set it aside. "We were escorting a medical convoy, simple mission or so we thought. There was this little Afghan girl by the roadside, couldn't have been more than 6. She was crying, holding a teddy bear." His voice grew distant. "I knew something was wrong. In that part of the world, kids don't just stand alone on roads. But she looked so much like my niece." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "What happened?" "The bear was rigged the moment I got close." He shook his head. "I spotted the wires too late, managed to get her clear, but the blast caught my leg. Sometimes I wonder if she survived, if she ever understood what they made her do." Without thinking, Eleanor reached for his hand. His fingers curled around hers, seeking anchor in the memory's storm. "You still tried to save her, even knowing the risk. Some choices make themselves." His thumb traced patterns on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "Like finding you in that storm." Her heart clenched. On the muted TV behind them, a newscrawler announced increased efforts to locate Eleanor Richardson with a substantial reward. Now offered for information. Her company's board had hired private investigators. They were checking security footage, interviewing witnesses. It was only a matter of time. "James," she started, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you—" A sharp knock at the door cut her off. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers. "Connor!" Mike's voice boomed through the door. "You're going to want to see this." James rose to answer, and Mike burst in, waving a newspaper. "They're doing a fundraiser at the center. Some big-shot CEO's company is matching donations. This could be huge for our veterans." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she caught sight of the paper. There, in full color, was her corporate headshot next. To the headline, "Richardson Technologies announces Veteran Support Initiative, despite CEO's mysterious absence." "Eleanor Richardson," Mike read aloud. "Been all over the news lately. Apparently just vanished a few weeks back. But her company's still doing good work. Look at her. Probably some rich lady who's never known a real day's trouble." James was studying the photo with an intensity that made Eleanor's pulse race. She watched recognition dawn in his eyes, saw him turn to look at her with dawning comprehension. The moment stretched between them like a wire about to snap. "I should check on dinner," she mumbled, fleeing to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she gripped the counter. Through the doorway, she heard Mike continuing to talk about the fundraiser, about what it could mean for their programs. James's responses were distracted, short. After Mike left, the apartment fell into heavy silence. Eleanor could feel James's presence behind her before he spoke. "How long were you going to wait to tell me?" She turned slowly, facing the hurt in his eyes. "I tried. So many times I tried. But how do you tell someone that you've been lying to them from the first moment? That you're not who they think you are? You're Eleanor Richardson." It wasn't a question. The billionaire CEO who disappeared without a trace. The woman whose face has been on every news channel for weeks. Yes, the word felt like ash in her mouth. "But I'm also the woman who shared coffee with you on that bench, who fell in love with your kindness, your honor, your simple truth." The confession slipped out before she could stop it. James stepped back as if she'd struck him. "Truth," he said, the word bitter. "That's an interesting choice of words." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Inside, Eleanor watched the best thing that had ever happened to her begin to crumble, and knew that the real storm was only beginning. The days following Eleanor's revelation had been tense, filled with half-finished conversations and careful distance, yet neither could bring themselves to make a clean break. James had moved to sleep on the couch, insisting Eleanor take the bedroom, and they'd fallen into an uneasy routine of polite exchanges and longing glances. Valentine's Day arrived with unexpected snow, blanketing Boston in pristine white. Eleanor woke to find James already gone, only a note on the kitchen counter. "We need to talk. Dinner tonight. Jay." She spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, trying to keep her hands busy. In the kitchen, she attempted his mother's lasagna recipe, something she'd watched him make countless times. In her previous life, she'd had chiefs at five-star restaurants at her beck and call. Now, here she was, covered in flour, fighting with pasta sheets, and caring more about this simple meal than any gourmet creation. The sound of his key in the lock made her jump. James stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, holding a small, wrapped package, and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "You cooked," he said, taking in the chaos in his kitchen. "I tried." She gestured at the slightly burnt edges of the lasagna. "Though I'm beginning to understand why my husband banned me from our kitchen 20 years ago." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Eleanor Richardson, billionaire CEO, can't cook lasagna?" Eleanor Richardson, billionaire CEO, never had to. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, nervous. "But Eleanor, the woman who's been sharing your home, wanted to try. For you." James set the package down and moved into the kitchen, surveying the damage. "Well, the smoke alarm didn't go off, so you're already doing better than my first attempt at cooking for someone special." The casual words made her heart skip. He began helping her clean up, their movements automatically synchronizing in the small space, bodies remembering the rhythm they'd developed over their weeks together. "I got you something," he said finally, pushing the package across the counter. "Was going to return it after, but decided you should have it anyway." Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "James made it myself. Part of occupational therapy after my injury. Never thought I'd use the skill again, but..." He shrugged. "The color reminded me of your eyes." Tears pricked at her corners of her eyes as she ran the soft wool through her fingers. "I have something for you too." She retrieved a small box from her room. Her old room, she corrected mentally. James opened it to find a worn military compass, clearly antique but beautifully maintained. "This is a World War II officer's compass," he said, voice full of quiet. "Or it was my father's. One of the few things I kept when I left. He always said it guided him home from Europe." She swallowed hard. "I thought, well, you helped me find my way when I was lost." It seemed fitting. Their eyes met over the gifts, the air suddenly thick with unspoken words. In the background, the old radio played softly. Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Overture, the universe's idea of a joke. "Why did you do it?" James asked finally. "Walk away from everything?" "Because everything was nothing." The words came easier now, here in this moment of truth. I had wealth, power, respect, everything except what mattered, real connections, real purpose. Then I met this man who shared his coffee with a stranger, who saved me from a storm, who showed me what it means to live with honor and compassion. "A man you lied to," he said, but the edge in his voice had softened. "Yes, and I will regret that every day. But I won't regret getting to know you, James Connor. You made me remember who I was before the money, before the power. You made me want to be that person again." James moved closer, reaching out to brush a smudge of flour from her cheek. "And who are you, really?" "Still figuring that out," she whispered, "but I'd like to do it with you if you'll let me." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "The lasagna's getting cold. It's probably inedible anyway." His laugh was soft, warm. "We'll order pizza, but first..." The kiss, when it came, tasted of forgiveness and new beginnings. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the city, Eleanor knew her past was still searching for her. But here, in this moment, with James's arms around her and the taste of flour and possibility on her lips, she was exactly where she needed to be. The first sign of trouble came during their morning walk to the Veterans Center. Eleanor spotted him before James did, a man in an expensive suit, showing her photograph to street vendors. Her steps faltered, and James's hand tightened protectively. "Around hers, private investigator," he murmured, smoothly guiding her down a side street. His military training kicked in automatically, eyes scanning for surveillance, body angled to shield her from view. There've been more of them lately. He was right. Over the past week, they'd noticed increased activity around the neighborhood. Dark sedans cruising slowly past James's apartment. Men in suits asking questions at local businesses. Eleanor's board was getting aggressive in their search. Back at the apartment, James paced while Eleanor watched the latest news report about her disappearance. The volume was low, but the words scrolled across the screen. "Richardson Technologies stock drops 15% amid CEO's continued absence. Board considers declaring emergency succession." "They're closing in," Eleanor said quietly. "The board won't stop until they find me. Too much money at stake." James paused by the window, checking the street below. "We could leave. I have contacts, people who owe me favors. We could disappear somewhere. James Connor offering to go on the run?" She tried to smile, but it trembled at the edges. What happened to the man who believes in facing things head-on? He turned to her, his face serious. "That man never had something this important to protect before." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. She crossed the room to him, fitting herself against his side as they both watched the street below. "I can't ask you to give up your life here, the Veterans Center, your work with the soldiers, Mike and Sarah. It's all too important." "You're not asking. I'm offering." His arm tightened around her waist. "Besides, maybe it's time for a change. We could find somewhere quiet, start fresh." A sharp knock at the door cut him off. They froze, hearts pounding. Through the door came Mike's urgent voice. "James, open up, brother. We've got a situation." James opened the door to find Mike looking uncharacteristically worried. "They were at the center," he said without preamble. "Two guys in suits asking questions about Eleanor, showing photos. Professional types, not the usual reporters." Eleanor sank onto the couch, legs weak. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful." Mike's eyes were kind as he looked at her. "But Sarah overheard them on the phone. They're expanding the search, planning to go door to door in this neighborhood. They've got recent security footage of this area." James was already moving, pulling out his go-bag, a habit from his military days. "We need to get you out of here. I know a place." "No." Eleanor's voice was firm. "Running will only make it worse." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I need to face this. But first, I need to make sure they understand what's really at stake." She moved to James's desk, pulling out paper and pen. Her hands were steady as she began to write, years of corporate authority flowing through. Her words, "This is a press release," she explained, "and a letter to the board. If I'm going to come back, it's going to be on my terms. No more hiding behind boardroom walls, no more decisions based solely on profit margins." James read over her shoulder as she wrote, his presence solid and reassuring. "You're going to transform the company into something that matters. Veterans programs, community outreach, real change, not just corporate philanthropy for tax breaks." She looked up at him. "That is, if I'll have a certain military consultant to help me design these programs?" "Eleanor," his voice was rough with emotion, "I'm tired of living two lives," she said, standing to face him. "Help me make them into one worth living." Mike cleared his throat from the doorway. "This is touching and all, but those suits will be here within the hour. Whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen fast." Eleanor nodded, turning back to her letter with renewed purpose. Outside, another black sedan cruised past the building. Time was running out, but for the first time since she'd walked away from her old life, she felt truly ready to face whatever came next. She had something worth fighting for now, not just James, but the chance to make something meaningful out of both their lives. The news broke like a tsunami. Eleanor watched from James's apartment as every local channel switched to breaking news. Missing billionaire found. Amateur photos of her and James walking to the Veteran Center splashed across screens, their joined hands circled in red by eager producers. Her carefully prepared press release was now just damage control. Ms. Richardson was reportedly living with a local veteran. The reporter's voice droned on as the story exploded. Within minutes, the street below filled with news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like hungry fingers. "Well," James said quietly from behind her, "I guess subtlety is off the table." His attempt at humor fell flat as camera flashes began lighting up the windows. The sanctuary of his small apartment was rapidly becoming a fishbowl. Eleanor's phone, the one she'd kept hidden but charged for emergencies, exploded with notifications. Her lawyer, her board members, her executive team, all demanding immediate responses. But it was the look on James's face that shattered her heart, a mixture of resignation and something deeper, more painful. "James, I don't." He held up a hand, military discipline evident in his rigid posture. "You need to handle this. Your company needs you. Those people down there need answers." He moved to the bedroom, returning with a small duffel bag. "I'll stay with Mike until things calm down. Please don't go." The words burst from her before she could stop them. "We can face this together. My letter to the board, the plans we made." "Your letter?" His laugh was hollow. "Eleanor, look outside. This isn't about letters anymore. Your whole world is about to come crashing back in, and He gestured at his modest apartment, at himself. "I'm not part of that world." As if to emphasize his point, Eleanor's lawyer's voice filled the room from the TV. "Ms. Richardson will be resuming her duties as CEO immediately. Any implications of impropriety or mental instability are categorically false. She was simply taking time to evaluate new directions for the company." "Impropriety?" James's voice was sharp. "Is that what they're calling us?" "I don't care what they call it." Eleanor moved toward him, but he stepped back. "James, everything I told you last night was true. About wanting to change things, about needing you to help me. Was anything real?" The question cut through her protests. "The woman I met on that bench, the one who shared my coffee and understood my silence, was she real or just another mask?" She was more real than Eleanor Richardson ever was. Tears threatened, but years of corporate training held them back. "You have to believe that." Outside, the crowd grew larger. Someone began shouting questions through a megaphone. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, the space between them growing wider with each passing second. "I believe you believe that," James said finally. "But right now you need to be Eleanor Richardson, CEO, and I need to—" He shouldered his bag, military efficiency in every movement. I need to not be here. Don't do this, she whispered. Don't make me choose. I'm not making you choose. Life is. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. You walked away from your world once because it wasn't real. Now you have a chance to make it real, to do something that matters. Don't waste that chance trying to hold on to a fantasy. You're not a fantasy. No. His smile was sad. I'm a broken soldier who fell in love with a woman on a park bench. But that woman needs to go save her company now. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that echoed louder than any slam could have. Eleanor stood alone in his apartment. Their apartment, as she'd begun to think of it, surrounded by the life they'd begun to build together. His mother's records, still stacked by the player, her scarf draped over his chair, their shared coffee mugs in the sink. On the TV, her corporate photo stared back at her, polished and perfect and utterly false. The woman who'd shared burnt lasagna and winter sunrises with James Connor seemed to fade like a dream in morning light, leaving only the CEO everyone expected her to be. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their shouts becoming more insistent. Eleanor Richardson straightened her shoulders, muscle memory of 1,000 press conferences taking over. It was time to face her old world. She only hoped that when the dust settled, there would be something left of her new one to salvage. Mike's spare room felt like a cell to James. 3 days had passed since he'd walked away from Eleanor, and every news channel seemed determined to torture him with her face. He channel surfed restlessly, watching corporate Eleanor handle press. Conferences with grace, her CEO mask firmly in place, but he could see the strain around her eyes, the same strain he'd noticed when she first sat on his park bench. You're being an idiot, Mike announced, dropping a manila folder on James's lap. Sarah did some digging, thought you should see this. James opened the folder skeptically, then froze. Inside were dozens of documents, private donations, anonymous, grants, carefully hidden paper trails leading back to Eleanor Richardson. But it was the dates and recipients that caught his attention. The Veteran Center's emergency fund? His fingers traced the document. That anonymous donation that saved us from closing last year. That was her. Keep reading. Mike's voice was gentle. James flipped through more papers. A scholarship program for veterans' children. Medical funds for soldiers denied VA coverage. Housing initiatives for homeless vets, all anonymous, all traced back to Eleanor. There's more, Mike said, pulling up a video on his tablet. Security footage from the center 6 months ago. The grainy video showed Eleanor, the corporate Eleanor, elegant in a business suit, quietly leaving an envelope with the center's director. The timestamp was 3 a.m., no press, no fanfare, just a silent act of support. She's been helping veterans for years, Mike continued. Long before she met you, Sarah found a pattern. Every time Richardson Technologies had a profitable quarter, anonymous donations would show up at veteran organizations across the country. James's hands were shaking. Why didn't she tell me? Same reason she didn't tell you who she was at first. Some things mean more when they're not about recognition. Mike sat heavily in the adjacent chair. You know what Sarah said? She said, maybe Eleanor needed to become homeless to finally feel at home. The weight of understanding settled over James, like a physical presence. He remembered Eleanor's skill with the veterans at the center, her genuine concern for their struggles. It hadn't been an act. It had been the real Eleanor breaking through, years of corporate armor. His phone buzzed, a text from Eleanor. The board meeting is tomorrow. After that, whatever happens, I'd like to explain, if you'll let me. James stared at the message, remembering her words about wanting to transform the company, about making both her lives into one worth living. He'd accused her of living a fantasy, but looking at the evidence of years of secret kindness spread across his lap, he wondered if he was the one who'd failed to see reality. You know, Mike said, heading for the door, for a tactical expert, you've got a real blind spot. Sometimes the richest people are the poorest in spirit, and sometimes finding the right person means letting them be both who they were and who They're becoming. James picked up one last document, a draft proposal Eleanor had written the morning everything fell apart. Plans for a comprehensive veteran support program, integrating Richardson Technologies' resources with on-the-ground veteran services. In the margins were notes in her familiar handwriting. Ask James about implementation and need his expertise. For this to work, she hadn't been running from her life. She'd been trying to build a bridge between her worlds, with him as the cornerstone. Outside, the setting sun painted Boston's skyline in shades of gold. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, Eleanor was preparing to face her board, to fight for the changes she believed in. The question was, would she face it alone? James's military training had taught him to recognize when he'd made a tactical error. His heart told him he'd made an emotional one. Now he had to decide if he was brave enough to admit both. The Richardson Technologies headquarters gleamed like a crystal fortress in the morning sun. James stood across the street, watching dark-suited figures stream through the revolving doors. His reflection in a storefront window showed a man transformed. Dress uniform pressed to perfection, medals aligned with military precision. Mike had insisted he wear it. If you're going to crash a Billionaire's board meeting, he'd said, do it with authority. Security was tight, but James had Mike's wife Sarah to thank for what happened next. As head of veteran outreach, she'd insisted on attending the board meeting to discuss their partnership programs. Her text was simple: back entrance, 10 minutes, don't be late. Eleanor's voice carried through the boardroom doors as James approached, Sarah walking confidently beside him. The company's future cannot be measured in quarterly profits alone. Ms. Richardson, a male voice interrupted, dripping with condescension, your recent emotional journey has clearly affected your judgment. The board feels nervous. Eleanor shot back, steel in her voice. Because I'm proposing we be more than just another soulless corporation. James slipped into the room, standing quietly at the back. Eleanor stood at the head of a massive table, surrounded by suits and skeptical faces. She looked every inch the CEO in her tailored blazer, but he could see the woman he knew underneath, the one who'd shared his coffee and understood his silences. Your proposed veteran initiatives would cost millions, another board member protested. The shareholders want stability, a new voice cut in. Every head turned to find James stepping forward, his medals catching the morning light. And there's nothing more stable than a company that stands for something real. Who are you? Demanded the first board member. This is a closed meeting. James Connor, Special Forces, retired. His eyes met Eleanor's, saw the shock and hope warring in her expression. And I'm the man your CEO shared a park bench with when she was trying to remember who she was beyond these walls. Murmurs rippled through the room. Eleanor's hand trembled, slightly on the table, but her voice remained steady. James is right. Our shareholders want stability, but they also want to invest in companies that make a difference. Our veteran initiative isn't just charity, it's smart business. With all due respect, James continued, moving to stand beside her, I've seen your CEO's real leadership skills. Not in this boardroom, but in a veteran center kitchen, helping soldiers piece their lives back together. That's the kind of leader who builds loyalty. That's the kind of company people believe in. This is absurd, the first board member sputtered. We're not running a charity. No, Eleanor cut in, drawing strength from James's presence. We're building a legacy. Richardson Technologies has the resources to transform veterans' lives while growing our business. The question isn't whether we can afford to do this. The question is, can we afford not to? She laid out her vision. Technology training programs for veterans, rehabilitation centers equipped with Richardson Tech's cutting-edge medical devices, corporate partnerships with veteran-owned businesses. With each point, James added tactical insights from his military experience, their words weaving together as naturally as their lives had. The boardroom fell silent when they finished. Finally, The chairwoman spoke. "I must admit, Ms. Richardson, when you disappeared, we feared we'd lost our CEO. Instead, it seems you've found yourself and brought us a valuable new perspective in the process." The vote was called. One by one, hands raised in support of Eleanor's initiatives. The hostile takeover attempt dissolved in the face of her passionate leadership and James's steady presence. As the board members filed out, Eleanor turned to James, her professional mask finally cracking. "You came. Couldn't let you fight this battle alone." He reached for her hand, not caring who saw. "I'm sorry I walked away. You came back. That's what matters." Her fingers interlaced with his. "Think you can handle being part of this world?" James smiled, remembering the documents Mike had shown him, the years of quiet kindness that had led them both to this moment. "I think we can handle building something new together." Spring bloomed over Boston as Eleanor's office transformed into a war room of a different kind. The massive mahogany desk was covered with blueprints for veteran rehabilitation centers, while the walls displayed flowcharts of training programs and employment initiatives. In the corner, James's worn leather jacket hung comfortably next to her designer blazers, a visual representation of their worlds merging. "The Texas facility is ready for the pilot program," Eleanor announced, marking off another item on their extensive checklist. 20 veterans start their tech training next month." James looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing security protocols for the new centers. "Mike says we've got more applicants than spots. Might need to expand sooner than we planned." "Then we'll expand." Eleanor's decisiveness, once reserved for corporate acquisitions, now served a different purpose. The board approved the additional funding yesterday, something about the stock price hitting record highs after the press caught wind of our initiatives. They shared a knowing smile. The media had transformed their story from a scandal into an inspiration. The billionaire CEO who found her heart by losing her way, and the veteran who helped her find a new purpose. But the real story was in the details they were building. "Together." "There's something else," James said, moving to stand behind her chair. "The VA representatives want to talk about implementing our PTSD treatment program nationwide. They're impressed with the preliminary results." Eleanor leaned back against him, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability that only he saw. "It's really happening, isn't it? Everything we talked about that night in your apartment." "Speaking of apartments," James interjected, his hands resting on her shoulders, "don't you think it's time we discussed our living situation?" "Your mansion is beautiful, but it doesn't feel like home," Eleanor finished. She turned to face him. "I've been thinking about that. What if we did both? Keep the small apartment for when we need to feel normal. Use the mansion for fundraisers and veteran events. Two worlds, but on our terms this time." "Exactly." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "I spent so long trying to be one person or the other, the CEO or the woman on the bench. But maybe the answer was never about choosing." James joined her at the window, his reflection overlapping with hers in the glass. "The soldiers in our program don't have to choose either. They can be warriors and tech experts, fighters and healers." Eleanor's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "The board meeting's in an hour. Ready to shake things up some more?" "Always." He kissed her temple. "Though maybe this time you could avoid disappearing for weeks afterward." "The bench gets cold without you." She laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way it never had been before her park bench days. "No more running, but maybe this weekend we could grab coffee there, for old time's sake." Their reflection showed two people who had found something rare, the ability to be exactly who they were, together. Outside the office, they could hear the busy sounds of their veteran program in action. Phones ringing, voices discussing training, schedules, the hopeful energy of lives being rebuilt. "First," James said, pulling her closer, "we need to finalize the plans for the new mental health wing at the center. Sarah's got 3 counselors ready to start," and Eleanor silenced him with a kiss. "Always the soldier planning the next mission. Always the CEO making it happen." he countered softly. Together they turned back to the blueprints spread across her desk, their different perspectives merging into a shared vision. The world outside might see a power couple reshaping corporate America's relationship with veterans, but in that moment they were simply James and Eleanor, building something that mattered. Billionaire's romance, a publicity stunt. The headline glared from the tablet in Eleanor's hands. James watched her face darken as she read further. They were in his apartment, their apartment now, their chosen refuge from the mansions. Grandeur! They're questioning everything, Eleanor said, tossing the tablet aside. Our relationship, the veteran programs, my time on the streets. Some are calling it an elaborate marketing scheme. Since when do marketing schemes involve frostbite? James quipped, referring to their fateful night in the storm. He moved to the kitchen, their morning coffee ritual unchanged despite the chaos swirling around them. The media frenzy had intensified as their veteran initiatives gained national attention. Every major network wanted their story, eager to dissect the romance between the billionaire CEO and the decorated veteran. Their privacy was under constant siege. Senator Matthews called again, Eleanor said, accepting her coffee. Strong, on sugar, just as she'd had it that first morning on the bench. He wants us to testify before the Congressional Committee on Veteran Affairs. Says our corporate military partnership model could revolutionize veteran care nationwide. James sat beside her, his military training evident in his thoughtful silence. Before speaking, it would mean going public, really public, no more hiding in our little world here. Are we hiding? Eleanor's question was gentle. Or are we just protecting something real? A knock at the door interrupted them. Mike burst in, looking harried. You need to see this. He turned on the TV, where a business news channel was running an exclusive exposé. Sources close to Richardson Technologies suggest the CEO's alleged homeless period was orchestrated by a PR firm, the reporter announced. Questions arise about the authenticity of her relationship with decorated veteran James Connor. They're interviewing my ex-husband, Eleanor said quietly, watching Gregory's smug face appear on screen. He's suggesting I planned everything, that I'm manipulating public sympathy for corporate gain. James's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Your turn, he said, their private signal for sharing burdens. The veterans at the center, she began, drawing strength from his touch. They don't care about stock prices or media scandals. They care that they're getting help. Real help. She turned to face him fully. Maybe it's time to stop letting others tell our story. Mike, who'd been unusually quiet, spoke up. The boys at the center have been asking about doing something. They want to stand up for you both. James straightened, an idea forming. Not just for us, for what we're building together. The next morning, every major network carried the same footage. Hundreds of veterans standing shoulder to shoulder outside Richardson Technologies. Many wore company training badges. Others carried signs. She gave us a future, and honor isn't just for soldiers. Eleanor and James emerged from the building together, their steps perfectly in sync. The press surged forward, questions overlapping. Ms. Richardson, how do you respond to allegations? Mr. Connor, sources suggest your relationship is... James's voice, honed by years of command, cut through the chaos. You want to know if our story is real? He gestured to the gathered veterans. Ask them. Ask the soldiers who are learning to code instead of struggling alone. Ask the families who have their loved ones back. Eleanor stepped forward, her corporate polish tempered by genuine emotion. I walked away from this company because I needed to remember its purpose. Thanks to James, thanks to every veteran who trusted us with their recovery, I found more than purpose. I found a way to make real change. A young veteran in a Richardson Tech badge stepped forward, one of their first program graduates. Ma'am, he addressed Eleanor with military courtesy. Permission to speak freely? At her nod, he turned to the cameras. I was lost when I left the service. Ms. Richardson's program didn't just give me job training. The way she and Mr. Connor worked together showed us you don't have to choose between who you were and who you're becoming. He straightened proudly. They're building a bridge, and we're all walking it together. The media's tone shifted in the days that followed. Pictures of veterans graduating from their programs replaced speculation about their relationship. Their congressional testimony drew bipartisan support for expanded veteran services. That evening, back in their apartment, James found Eleanor. Looking at their wall of photographs, corporate events now mixed with casual shots from the Veteran Center, their two worlds preserved in perfect balance. "Think we convinced them?" she asked, leaning back against his chest. "The ones who matter," he replied, remembering the proud faces of their program graduates. "The rest will catch up eventually." Eleanor turned in his arms. "You know, for a man who guards his privacy like a military secret, you handled the cameras well today." "Had good training," he smiled. "A certain CEO taught me that sometimes the best defense is complete transparency." Outside, the city hummed with life, unconcerned with media scandals or corporate politics. Inside, they had created their own truth, one built on coffee shared with strangers, storms weathered together, and the simple power of seeing someone for who they really are. The Veteran Center's main hall had been transformed. Where once there were basic folding chairs and motivational posters, now elegant decorations adorned the walls, though the military flags and honor roll remained prominently displayed. It was Eleanor and James's first joint television interview, and they'd insisted on doing it here, where their story had truly begun to unfold. 5 minutes to air, a producer called out. Eleanor sat beside James on their chosen set, not the center's office, but the simple break-room table where they'd shared so many conversations with veterans. She wore a designer suit, but her hand nervously fidgeted with the blue knitted scarf James had given her on Valentine's Day. "Steady," James murmured, his military bearing perfect in his dress uniform. "Just like we planned." The nationally renowned interviewer, Catherine Hayes, settled across from them as the cameras rolled. "Ms. Richardson, Mr. Connor, thank you for choosing to tell your story with us today. I have to ask, why here? Why not at Richardson Technologies headquarters?" "Because this is where the real work happens," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the room around them. "In places like this, where veterans become civilians again, where corporate resources meet human needs, and where a CEO found her heart," Catherine prompted with a smile. "No," James interjected, his voice gentle but firm. "Where she remembered. It was there all along." He reached for Eleanor's hand. "Show them the numbers." Eleanor nodded to someone off camera, and the center's director began distributing folders to the media present. "These are the statistics from our first year of veteran initiatives. Over 1,000 veterans trained in tech skills. Employment rate, 94%. Mental health program success rates double the national average." "Impressive figures," Catherine acknowledged, "but our viewers want to know about the romance, the billionaire and the soldier. It sounds like a movie plot." "It's not about romance," James said, then smiled at Eleanor. "Well, not just about romance. It's about seeing someone's true worth beyond their surface story." Eleanor saw our veterans not as charity cases, but as valuable assets waiting to be rediscovered. "Just as James saw me as more than a corporate title," Eleanor added, "or even a homeless woman on a bench." The interview was interrupted by a commotion at the door. A group of veterans from their first training cohort entered, led by Mike. Each wore a Richardson Tech employee badge along with their military service pins. "Sorry to interrupt," Mike announced, not looking sorry at all, "but we had something to share." He nodded to a young woman in the group. Sarah Chen, former Army sergeant and now a team leader in Richardson's tech division, stepped forward. "When I left the service, I thought my best days were behind me. Ms. Richardson and Mr. Connor didn't just give us jobs. They showed us how to build a bridge between our military pride and our civilian future." One by one, the veterans shared their stories. A former Marine who now led Richardson's cybersecurity team. a disabled army veteran who helped design adaptive technology for other wounded warriors. Each story built upon the last, painting a picture of transformation that went far beyond corporate charity. The cameras captured it all as Eleanor and James listened, their hands still clasped together. When the last veteran spoke, Eleanor stood, drawing James up with her. "You want to know if our story is real?" She addressed the cameras directly. "Look around you. Every person in this room is part of our story. Every veteran who finds their path forward, every corporate partner who joins our mission, every life changed. That's our love story." James stepped forward, his military bearing softening as he spoke. "I once thought I had to choose between my military past and my civilian future. Eleanor taught me that the best choices aren't about either or, they're about building something new from everything you are." The Richardson Technologies board members, who had quietly entered during the testimonials, moved to join them. The chairwoman stepped forward with an announcement that made the reporters scramble for their notepads. The board has unanimously voted to establish the Richardson Connor Veterans Foundation with an initial endowment of $1 billion. This separate non-profit entity will ensure that the work begun here continues regardless of corporate fluctuations. Eleanor's eyes widened. This hadn't been part of the plan. James squeezed her hand as the chairwoman continued. "Furthermore, we are creating a permanent position of Veteran Affairs Director, reporting directly to the CEO. Mr. Connor, we hope you'll accept the role, though we understand it may create some interesting dinner table conversations with your fiancé." The room erupted in surprised laughter and congratulations. Eleanor turned to James, shock evident on her face. "Fiancé?" He shrugged, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Was planning to ask you back at our bench, but..." He reached into his uniform pocket and dropped to one knee, drawing gasps from the crowd. "Eleanor Richardson, will you help me build bridges for the rest of our lives?" The ring was simple, a band of white gold with a small diamond. Eleanor recognized it immediately as his mother's, the one he'd shown her in a quiet moment of sharing family histories. Her yes was caught by every camera, but her whispered words were for him alone. "On one condition, we keep the apartment. Some bridges need anchors on both sides." As applause filled the room, as cameras flashed and reporters clamored for comments, as veterans and board members mingled in unprecedented equality, Eleanor and James shared a look of perfect understanding. They had created something larger than themselves, a legacy that would outlive their love story while being forever shaped by it. 1 year later, snow dusted Boston Common in a gentle December cascade, so different from the storm that had once brought them together. Eleanor and James sat on their bench. Yes, it was officially their bench now, complete with a small plaque commemorating the Richardson Connor Veterans Foundation's founding. They shared a thermos of coffee, just as they had that first morning. The wedding had been simple by Billionaire standards, held at the Veterans Center, officiated by Mike, with Sarah as matron of honor. Eleanor had worn a designer dress, but with James's hand-knitted scarf draped around her shoulders. Their vows spoke not just of love, but of purpose, to serve, to build, to bridge worlds together. "Hard to believe it's been a year," James mused, pouring them each a fresh cup. He still did his morning push-ups, still maintained his military precision, but the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by quiet contentment. "Harder to believe how much has changed," Eleanor replied. She'd kept her corporate authority, but now it was tempered by genuine warmth. The Richardson Connor Foundation had already expanded to 15 cities, each center a testament to their shared vision. Their lives had found an unexpected rhythm. Mornings began in their apartment, with coffee and classical music. Days were split between the corporate tower and veteran centers. Evenings often found them at the mansion, hosting fundraisers or strategy sessions, but they always returned to their simpler space, where their love had first grown real. A young veteran approached them, clearly recognizing them but hesitating to interrupt. Eleanor smiled warmly, remembering her own days of feeling like an outsider. "Join us?" The young woman's eyes widened. I just wanted to thank you. I start the tech program next week." "What's your name, soldier?" James asked, his tone carrying the respect of one warrior to another. "Jennifer Martinez, sir, former army medic." "Welcome to the family, Jennifer," Eleanor said, making room on the bench. "Would you like some coffee?" As they shared their thermos with Jennifer, listening to her hopes and fears about civilian life, Eleanor caught James's eye. In that glance passed their shared understanding. This was why they'd found each other, why their worlds had collided, not just for themselves, but for every soldier seeking home, every person needing a bridge between who they were and who they could become. The winter sun broke through the clouds, catching Eleanor's wedding ring. A simple band matched to James's. Mother's ring, both worn smooth by a year of hard work and tender moments. On her other wrist, she wore a bracelet made from his old dog tags, while his chest bore a small pin of Richardson Technologies' logo alongside his military medals. Their love story had become legend in Boston. The billionaire who found her. Soul by losing her way. The soldier who discovered his next mission in a simple act of kindness. But the real story was in moments like this, sharing coffee with a nervous veteran, building connections over steaming cups and shared understanding. As Jennifer left with new hope in her steps, James turned to Eleanor. "Ready for the board meeting?" A minute," she said, leaning into his shoulder. "Let's just be us for a moment longer." Above them, the old church bells chimed 9 o'clock, just as they had that first morning. But now their song rang not of loneliness, but of purpose found, worlds bridged, and love built on the strongest foundation of all, the simple truth of two hearts seeing each other completely. They rose together, leaving their bench to face another day of building bridges. The coffee thermos was empty, but their cup of purpose remained eternally full.